Good afternoon and welcome to this briefing by the Jerusalem Press Club. I'm Talia Dekel, CEO of the club. This week, US President Joe Biden announced that he would be withdrawing from the 2024 presidential campaign. This came after intense pressure from within his own party, a month after a televised debate in which former Republican President Donald Trump and the GOP's candidate for this election appeared victorious over the incumbent. In the interim, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced a visit to the United States, including a scheduled meeting with the president and a speech before both houses of Congress. Our guest today is senior fellow at the Jewish People's Policy Institute and analyst at the Israel Public Television, Shmuel Rosner, who has followed US politics and the country's relationship with Israel for more than 2 decades. We hope to hear how this dramatic decision will affect the US Israeli politics and as they continue to play out during the ongoing war, which is now well into its 11th month. Hello, Shmuel, and thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
So much can be said about the shockwaves Biden's decision has created and will continue to create in the US, but I would obviously like to focus today's conversation on its impact on us in Israel. Here's a president who on October 7th exemplified the strength of the Israeli-American alliance at its finest, but has since locked horns with Netanyahu. His administration has expressed displeasure with statements by some of the ministers in Netanyahu's government and has presided over unprecedented actions like sanctions against individual settlers in the West Bank. So first focusing on Israel, do you think that his departure from the campaign is good for the Jews or bad for the Jews?
Well, that depends on the Jews and depends on their goals. But by and large, it is hard to deny that President Biden is a great supporter of Israel throughout his long career in politics. He's an American president that called himself a Zionist, something that I think has great significance, especially these days when in some quarters and some people tend to delegitimize the mere usage of the word Zionist as something that has positive connotation. So first of all, I will give him due credit for the many things that he did for Israel. But as you said, in the last couple of months, there were differences of opinion between him and the government of Israel. And hence, for many Israelis, it is assumed, or by many Israelis, it is assumed that Biden was great supporter of Israel at the outset of the war. We were all, we all felt emotionally attached by his visit to Israel just a few days after the initiation of the war. But then, as his support diminished or his tone changed, many Israelis felt that domestic political considerations made Biden less supportive of Israel, in the latest month of the war. And so, if you ask me what Israelis feel today, they feel that Biden is a supporter, but not as much or not to the extent that they want the American president to be a supporter. And hence, many of them would hope that coming next January, someone else will sit in the White House.
So thank you for that. And we're going to talk a little bit about who that someone else might be and what impact that would have. Here, of course, staying within the party for now, do you think that a President Kamala Harris would be a friend to Israel? We've heard various opinions on that.
My most updated view on this is that we don't know. There are certain things that we do know about Kamala Harris. We know things about her background. We know things about her experience. But by and large, as vice president, Kamala Harris did not have her own foreign policy. Everything she did or said in the last couple of years was first as a candidate, but mostly as vice president to an experienced foreign policy president. Hence, certain things that she said and were not quite comfortable to Israeli ears or certain positions that she took in the last couple of months. I don't attribute these positions to Kamala Harris. I attribute them to the Biden administration. She, by and large, had to toe the administration's position. And if she played a good cop or a bad cop, it was probably because of certain hints or requests that she got from the president or his close advisors. We also know that Kamala Harris is not part of the generation to which President Biden came from. He's a person of the 1940s. She's of the 1960s. He grew up on the Israel of, first Holocaust, then independence. She grew up as Israel was already a fact, and maybe was influenced by the First Lebanon War or the First Intifada or the Oslo Accords. It's a different, America is a different America. Israel is a different Israel. The background is different background. So I think expecting Kamala Harris to have in her gut the same feelings towards Israel that President Biden has would be unrealistic, and therefore I don't expect such thing to happen.
I mean, definitely she's not a member of the same generation, but she's not even a member of the next generation of many of the Democratic leaders, including those who are affiliated with the so-called Squad, which takes the Democratic Party even further away from Israel. Israel used to enjoy bipartisan support in the US. Has Israel become a completely partisan issue, in your opinion?
Well, it became more of a partisan issue. Completely partisan, I think, would be an overstatement. But clearly, Israel did not have the same position it used to have 20 or 30 years ago in American politics. When you think about presidents such as Bill Clinton or even the term of George W. Bush, America was less polarized. Israel was less polarized. The relations were handled in a more comfortable way by, trying to remain above the political frame, to remain as a bipartisan cause. Being a partisan cause in the United States became something that might no longer be tenable. This is not about Israel, it's about the United States. The United States is a highly polarized place. And in the United States, it's hard for me to think about anything that is bipartisan in America today. Maybe the fear of China is bipartisan in the United States. But most other causes can no longer remain bipartisan in the United States. And Israel suffers, as many other things suffer from this polarization of American society.
Last week we had a webinar, a briefing with Amir Avivi, who gave kind of a security analysis on the situation. And he just stopped short of saying that Israel needs to wait for President Trump win in order to become fully victorious in this war. Do you agree with that?
No, I disagree with that. I don't think that the US administration is the one preventing Israel from being victorious. It is true that there were differences between the countries, that there were differences of opinion between the governments, and that the United States did put some obstacles on Israel's way to achieving its goals. But let me be honest here, I'm not always clear on the exact goals of the Israeli government. It's not clear that within the Israeli government there are agreements on the goals of Israel. So I think putting too much emphasis on the obstacles put by the United States and not enough emphasis on Israel's internal domestic disagreements and differences of opinions would be an overstatement. It is true, though, that there is today a majority in Israel who would want Donald Trump to win the next election. This has been the traditional position of Israelis for the last couple of decades. Israelis feel more, a majority of Israelis, of course, not all of them, but the majority of Israelis do feel more comfortable with Republican presidents. It was true in 2004 with Bush versus Kerry, and 2008 with McCain versus Obama, and again with Romney versus Obama, and so on and so forth. Israelis will be more comfortable with Trump administration coming January, although they realize today what they did not understand back in 2016, that Donald Trump could be somewhat unpredictable. That the most predictable thing about Donald Trump is that he will become an unpredictable president. So they understand that there are overall risks involved in him becoming the next president and not just rewards.
That's totally fair. We saw an outpouring of support for Israel by the American Jewish community on October 7th for obvious reasons. And this is following a relationship that was somewhat marred in the months prior to the attacks because of the internal political crisis, because of the government's judicial reform attempts. Do you think that a win by Donald Trump, putting the Israeli voice aside, focusing on the Jewish community, would a win by Donald Trump, who was largely rejected by the Democratic-leaning Jewish community in his previous term, push Jews away from Israel, assuming that a right-wing government is still in power?
I think what happened to both Israel and American Jews after October 7th is that in both communities, we got a clear reminder that our margin of error is pretty thin, and that the ice we walk on is also pretty thin. For American Jews, it was not just the attack on Israel. It was also the aftermath in the United States. It was the protests in university campuses. It was the type of language that opponents of Israel tended to use, verge on anti-Semitic language, and sometimes even, clearly anti-Semitic language. So I think both
and also denial of the gravity of the attack.
Denial of the tragedy, denial of the massacre, all kinds of things that reminded both Jews in Israel and Jews outside of Israel that there are true haters out there, and that they mean to harm us in very specific and clear ways that we could now, look at and understand in the most vivid way possible. So I think this got both Israeli Jews and American Jews somewhat closer. This is true, again, when we poll Israeli Jews today and we ask them about their relations with American Jews, they say things that manifest their understanding that Jews all around the world share some kind of destiny and fate. And hence, I don't think a Trump administration is going to immediately distance American Jews from Israeli Jews. Of course, it's always more comfortable for everybody when there's a president that both Israelis feel comfortable with and American Jews are comfortable with. The last such president was Bill Clinton in the first half of his term, in the first 4 years of his term. Since 1996 or 1997, it was always tricky. With Bush, Israelis, had high regard for him. American Jews, not as much. With Obama, it was the opposite. With Trump, again, the opposite. With Biden, except for a very short, honeymoon at the beginning of the war, again, American Jews felt highly comfortable with him. For Israelis, it was a mixed baggage. So having a Trump administration is going to be tricky for these relations. Then again, something very serious happened after October 7th in both communities. And I think that by and large, this pulled them towards one another. And I think that this will remain a trend that will have impact even after the next American election.
Understood. Moving on to kind of the Middle East in a more regional perspective, we know how Biden has dealt with Iran in his term. The instruction of don't, the one word he used regarding potential retaliatory attacks on Israel, pretty much went unnoticed to Iran, who have continued targeting Israel directly or indirectly through their proxies, whether it's through the Houthis or otherwise. Do you think that a different president, whether it's Ms. Harris or even Trump again, would change the scenario? Would Iran respond differently to either one of the candidates, in your opinion?
Well, that's hard to tell. It's true that for Iran, the warning by President Biden did not, was not an intimidation that they could not cope with. We don't know. In fact, we don't know if the initial don't played a role in preventing a more severe attack from Lebanon on Israel. It might have played such role, and Israel might have avoided a larger war because of the warning by President Biden. It is also true that President Biden prevented Israel from using its force in more dramatic ways, both in Gaza and in Lebanon, because it was clearly very important for him to prevent an expansion of the conflict to Lebanon and other areas. If I need to predict what's going to happen with the next administration, a Harris administration will likely be quite similar to what we see from the Biden administration, with some potential nuances. I assume that the Trump administration will give Israel freer hands in dealing with its neighbors and enemies, but I'm not sure that the Trump administration is going to use its own resources in trying to tackle or intimidate Iran or one of its proxies. Trump's perspective on these issues is somewhat isolationist, in the sense that he does not want the United States directly involved in regional conflicts. On the other hand, he doesn't have the same tendency to look at international organizations and players, the International Court, the UN, human rights organizations, etc., as something that needs to be considered as you tell Israel what it can't and can do. So again, freer hand, but when it comes to dealing with Iran and with its proxies, I think Israel is in some ways on its own right now. The only potential allies for such struggle are going to be what we call the moderate Sunni Arabs. So if Israel is able to strengthen its alliance with Egypt, with the Emirates, potentially with Saudi Arabia, these are going to be Israel's allies in fighting against Iran, with the backing of the United States, but I don't see any direct involvement from the United States on this issue.
Do you believe that to be true also with regards to kind of more international topics like Iran's progression perhaps to a nuclear bomb? We saw with President Trump that his administration left the JCPOA. They took a more active role in sanctions at the time. This, of course, is an existential issue for Israel. Do you think that the next leader of the free world will take a more activist or a sideline kind of position with regards to the nuclear issue?
I don't think that sanctions on Iran are going to prevent the Iranians from developing nuclear weapons. This depends mostly on A, their decision to move in such direction, and B, forceful and very difficult move by Israel or Israel and other countries in using military force in trying to prevent Iran from acquiring such weapon. It's true that the Trump administration tried one methodology, leaving the agreement, bolstering the sanctions. It didn't quite work. We must say that other attempts or other methodologies were also not quite successful. So I think at this point we need to face reality. It's either using military force or convincing the Iranians that acquiring such weapons will be highly harmful for them, and they will stay just below the surface with their nuclear capabilities, or we will have to face a nuclear Iran and deal with this new reality.
We're going to attempt at using the last few minutes that we have together to really address Netanyahu's trip to Washington, and a little bit maybe about how U.S.-Israel relations tie to the politics in Israel. With regards to Netanyahu's trip this week, what do you think we might see from the meetings with the president or from the speech in Congress? Do you think that President Biden is able to, in the next few months that he has left of his presidency, to seal a ceasefire deal? We heard Netanyahu this morning tell families of the hostages in Gaza that we are closer to a deal than before.
Well, there is a debate within Israel about the deal. It's not clear to me what Israel is willing to do to get a deal. It's always not clear what Hamas is willing to do to get a deal. In the last couple of days, Netanyahu raised a few issues that will be an obstacle to a deal. He, in some ways, demanded things that were not previously demanded by Israel, and such demands might make a deal more difficult. On the other hand, it's clear that Israel is making progress on the ground in Gaza, and hence pressure on Hamas to have some kind of deal in order to prevent Israel from completely annihilated Hamas forces is also going to be a factor. So this is, the devil here is in the details. Netanyahu is going to present his position to the president. The president is going to ask him for some room for maneuver, and ultimately it will be a combination of pressure on the ground, pressure by the Israeli public, domestic politics, and the pressures that Netanyahu faces within his coalition. And if a deal emerges that can be presented to the public in certain light, and that the Netanyahu coalition will accept, then Netanyahu will sign such deal. If no such deal emerges, I don't think Netanyahu is going to risk his coalition in a big way in order to have a deal.
Do you think that Netanyahu will bring up the issue of stalled military aid being given to Israel? There were promises made by Biden on 2,000-pound bombs and other munitions. How will this be part of the talks, if at all?
Well, I'm sure this will be raised in the meetings between the Prime Minister and the top administration officials that he's about to meet, including the president himself. Whether he's going to mention it in some way in his speech, maybe he's going to include a hint on this issue. I don't think he's going to use his speech in Congress to attack or to criticize the administration in any specific and clear way. But he might say some things about the need for the United States to support Israel without restrictions on such moment, and for the need of Israel to have the ammunition that it needs in order to fight the war, not just against Hamas, the weaker force in Gaza, but also to be able to deter and potentially have a war against Israel's enemies in the north and now in Yemen as well.
One journalist is asking about the speech specifically. It was reported this morning that Vice President Harris will not be attending the joint session, but will still meet with him separately. Is this some kind of precedent where the vice president is slighting an elected premier? Have we seen this kind of thing before? What does it say about her relationship with Netanyahu, with Israel?
Well, she mentions some scheduling issues. She's going to publicly meet with Netanyahu. But look, the Netanyahu's speech is not something that the administration wanted or asked for. This was done against the administration's will. In some way, the speech became a marginal event in Washington. Let's be honest here. It's not as if Americans are eagerly waiting to hear what Netanyahu has to say this week. They are much busier with more dramatic domestic issues. Kamala Harris is now a presidential candidate. She has to worry about her very short campaign that she will have to launch now. And with all due respect to Netanyahu, it's important that she meets him, but to cancel her campaign rallies for him at this moment, I'm not sure that's her first priority.
Okay, so I think a good place to finish would be with the Israeli political scene and how it relates to these issues. In case of early elections in Israel, which polls say should be on the agenda, how do you think the various candidates might take advantage of the diplomatic situation to push their different agendas?
Well, many Israelis believe that Netanyahu's visit in Washington this week is an internal political domestic Israeli affair. That the whole thing was done in order to let Netanyahu have his day in the limelight and get some positive attention and positive media coverage, etc. It must be said, I assumed that at this point we will be in the midst of election cycle in Israel. I thought that Israel is going to have no election before the end of 2024, and I was wrong. It's important to admit false predictions. I made the false prediction that Israel will have election in 2024. Currently, what we see is that the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, is going to end its summer term within 10 days. Early election will not be called, and hence for Netanyahu, there is some breathing room. He's going to have up until the end of October before the Knesset reconvenes. And even if no election will be called immediately after the Knesset reconvenes, this will already be in early 2025 and not in 2024. So in some way, Netanyahu can look to the future with some optimistic outlook. He has his coalition. The coalition seems fairly stable. The Knesset will not be in session, so no one is able to force him into a new election. The war will advance. Potentially, there will be a hostage deal, which will certainly ease the tensions in Israel. And if in early November, Donald Trump is elected president, the prime minister will argue that with such new administration, it is good for Israelis to let him stay in power. So the outlook for him, politically speaking, is more positive today than 2 or 3 months ago, even though we must say his approval rating in Israel did not improve. His approval rating is very low, around 30%. and that's true from the outset of the war and up until today. He was not able to gain the trust and the support of most Israelis during 9 months of war. He might have another chance in the next 2 or 3 months.
Just one follow-up question, and then we'll let you go. In regards to what you're saying, is this still true in the case of a hostage deal? Because we do know that his coalition partners have opposed one, at least one that doesn't include total defeat of Hamas, which we understand is not necessarily attainable in the current deal on the shelf, as well as some of his constituents themselves, and whether this will impact him politically.
So I said earlier, I don't think Netanyahu is going to risk his coalition with a deal that will potentially lead to a new election. Everything he did in the last almost 2 years since he was re-elected, everything he did proves that his first priority is to preserve his right-wing religious coalition. And I think that all decisions that will be made by him will be made with an eye on the stability of the coalition. He will try to put together a deal that with which he could convince his coalition partners to remain within the coalition and not quit and call for new election. Again, I might be wrong, but everything we've seen up until now points to the possibility that for Netanyahu, a first priority is to preserve the coalition.
And if you are wrong, I'm sure you'll bring it up next in our next webinar.
I'll be the first one to admit my error, as I try to always do.
Well, and we'll continue to seek your sound insights. Shmuel Rosner, Senior Fellow at the Jewish People's Policy Institute and an analyst at Israel Public Television. Thank you today for your time, as always.
It was a pleasure.
And thank you also to my colleagues, Jonathan Beck and Ali Naor, for facilitating this call. Have a good day.